Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on motor control and how the cerebrum allows us to control our bodies. The intention to contract a muscle is going to start in that primary motor area, or excuse me, the premotor area of the frontal lobes. So this is where we're going to plan our behavior, and then we have a predetermined checklist, our program that we're going to put together within our brains. This is going to determine the sequence of muscle contractions. This premotor area of the frontal lobe will then send that information to the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus has the primary motor area associated on it. So remember, there's the central sulcus, and then the gyrus directly anterior, directly rostral to it, is going to be the precentral gyrus. And it's the most posterior gyrus of the frontal lobe. So for those of you who've been able to stay on top of the lab objectives, you should know exactly where this is now at this point in time. And the neurons from here are going to send signals to the brainstem, and then from the brainstem to the spinal cord, and ultimately lead to skeletal muscle contraction. While we're working through this, as we look at the precentral gyrus, we're able to make a homunculus just like we can with the postcentral gyrus. We have some somatotopy being exhibited here. And as we look at this process, it's very similar in terms of the layout. A notable difference is that with the precentral gyrus, we have the addition of the tongue compared to the postcentral gyrus on its homunculus. And then on the postcentral gyrus, there was a region over here dedicated to sensation in the genitals. Our precentral gyrus doesn't have an area dedicated to movement of the genitals because we don't have a lot of skeletal muscles and voluntary movement of our genitals. As we're looking at the neurons associated for toe movement, they're very deep within the longitudinal fissure. And then as we're progressing, we have the trunk and torso of the body along the superior margin. And then as we start to head laterally, we'll have the hand be processed on the lateral margin and superior margin. And then as we start to head inferiorly, we'll have the head being processed. These motor homunculi are distorted because we have differing sizes of the motor units. Our face and our hands and our tongue have very small motor units, so we can have very fine control over those areas of our body. Our trunk, our torso, our legs, and our arms have small motor units, and we don't have very fine control over those areas of our body. As we look at the pyramidal cells that are present, if you can't remember, a pyramidal cell is roughly conical, and it's going to be a cell that will connect the cerebrum with underlying areas. They have very, very long axons. So these pyramidal cells are within the precentral gyrus are known as the upper motor neurons. They will originate there, and then their fibers are going to project caudally and make all the way to the brainstem or the spinal cord. So these pyramidal cells have axons or nerve fibers that can transmit information a good distance, multiple centimeters. As we're looking at where those fibers terminate, some of them will terminate within the nuclei of the brainstem. Some are going to form the cortical spinal tracts within the spinal cord. There's also going to be some desiccation or crossing over within the lower medulla oblongata. And then they will also form lateral cortical spinal tracts. So they'll form more tracts within the spinal cord. In the brainstem or spinal cord, these fibers are typically going to synapse with the lower motor neurons, and then those lower motor neurons will then have their axons go directly to the skeletal muscle. So we have our primary and our secondary neurons, our second order neuron associated with this. We have our basal nuclei, which we've talked about in a prior recording, and our cerebellum. These two parts of the brain help to modulate or regulate the activity of these pyramidal cells so that we avoid unwanted movements and have more coordinated muscle control. As we look at the basal nuclei, it prevents, it helps to control the onset, the beginning and ending of intentional movements. So if we want to start moving, if we want to stop moving, this is what the basal nuclei is for. If we have repetitive movements, the basal nuclei can help us to modulate those repetitive movements. And then if we're looking at highly practiced behaviors or muscle memory, writing, how to drive a car. For those of you who are in athletic, there's lots of muscle memory. Athletics, there's lots of muscle memory associated with athletics as well. Anything that can involve some kind of highly practiced learned behavior is going to be modulated by that basal nuclei. These basal nuclei are going to be in a feedback loop or feedback circuit with the cerebrum to the basal nuclei and then back to the thalamus and back to the cerebrum. So they're going to be constantly interacting with the other parts of the brain in order to help modulate activities. If we have dyskinesis or abnormal movement of the body, they can be occurring, those abnormal movements can occur when there's lesions or strokes within the basal nuclei. And if the basal nuclei are damaged, oftentimes what this damage will manifest itself as in a patient is tremors or twitching within that patient. As we look at the cerebellum, our cerebellum is going to have a lot of motor coordination, primarily when we look at the temporal lobe of the cerebellum. It has a large area dedicated to being its association motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is going to be in that precentral gyrus, but the association motor cortex is going to have multiple gyri involved. And the cerebellum here within the brain, I should apologize. When I was saying cerebellum, I was having a bit of a brain hiccup. I meant to not point to the cerebrum. I meant to point to the cerebellum down here. Forgive me. So as we're looking at the cerebellum interacts with the temporal lobe of the cerebrum and also interacts with sensory information coming from the eyes and the vestibulocochlear apparatus of the inner ear to help us modulate our sense of orientation in space. The cerebellum aids us with learning motor skills, helps us to maintain muscle tone and posture. It's going to coordinate overall body movements. And as we're looking at the cerebellum, as we look at this list, it's coordinating movement of joints, movements of eyes, smooth muscle contractions, overall muscle tone and posture. The cerebellum allows for us to have lots of unconscious coordination of the muscle of our bodies. If there's some kind of a lesion within the cerebellum, we can have ataxia take place. And ataxia is the technical term for a clumsy or awkward gait that a patient may manifest. That's all we have for this recording. Class, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the class discussion boards or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.